Hello, welcome to tutorial 2. Bit of a departure, recording it and presenting it in this way. But as with the introduction, I hope it makes you, and the first tutorial, of course, I hope it makes you think. So this is about innovation. So let's crack on. Innovation, of course, is a subject or is a term, a concept, a construct that is not without a degree of controversy. What is it? We're aware that firms are required to innovate. That we are taught that innovation is the central requirement for a firm to be able to maintain, to obtain in the first instance, and then maintain its competitive advantage. But that seems to me to be a rather limited definition of what innovation is. And I think that we can rely upon the works of Joseph Schumpeter for a good working definition, which we might change, and we might reconsider it, and it's worth thinking about it when at work people will say we need to be more innovative. Is that what exactly do they mean? And so we'll rely upon Schumpeter, I think, for the nature of this particular um, presentation, although we might challenge it as we go through. And Schumpeter defines innovation as the practical application of an invention. So innovation, therefore, is something that occurs once one applies an invention. Now, Schumpeter wrote his book, his famous book called, oh crikey, what was it called? Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy. He wrote it in the 1940s. And Schumpeter's interesting. The book itself is actually quite controversial, and many of its controversial aspects are very much, to my mind anyway, seem to be glossed over because we only look at what Schumpeter wrote about innovation and business and capitalism and so on and so forth. But what Schumpeter did state within his work was that the democracy itself is at threat from capitalism, in that innovation within capitalism will continue to occur to the extent that actually the society becomes dominated by a kind of capitalist structure which looks very oligopolistic, and that democracy becomes displaced by a requirement to feed and keep the capitalist machine going. And he argues that ultimately capitalism will become displaced by some form of socialism, which is quite radical, quite controversial. But it's also, I think, quite prescient in that the forms of innovation that we're seeing in our business world today do seem to be looking towards, well, they seem to be concentrated in certain areas and certain firms. Now, that's very at odds, I think, with what we were referring to in terms of innovation, where we're looking at innovation as being this practical application of an invention, or I would sort of like practical application of an idea. Is that how do you take an idea and you turn it into something that is therefore defined as being innovative? How do we apply it to do something new, something novel? And of course, I think the challenge here is twofold. One is, where do the ideas come from? Have we got any ideas? And the other one is, having got the ideas, how do you sift through them to work out which ones are practically applicable and which ones of them are we going to try and apply, and how might we go about doing that adequately? Now, I think that we could take this back to what you're doing on the course. is that how do you apply an idea? How do you take something that you've learned, the idea, and how do you apply it practically into your own practice? And you're engaged in a process of idea creation, being creative, and idea action, ideation, in terms of your own management practice. But of course, when you aggregate these up to the organization itself, it becomes much more challenging. But what we're talking about here is this notion of innovation and its importance, where innovation has been determined or defined as being a practical application of an invention, an idea. And there is the man himself, Schumpeter. And he said that innovation can be distinguished by an object of innovation, products versus processes, distinguished by intensity of effects, whether it be incremental versus radical. These are just taxonomies of innovations themselves. Effect on performance, the traditional, i.e. the majority versus the disruptive, the minority, disruptive innovation, which is certainly very applicable to our world in digital technologies, isn't it? Because of the word that becomes associated with many of these digital players and technologies is that it's disruptive. So innovation can be determined by the effect that we might have on skills. We might see innovations in different skills. We might reevaluate existing skills, and some skills might be devaluated. And there might be the generation, the creation of new skills built upon the old, but innovation in our skill sets. We could look at innovation in terms of the development methodologies, how it comes about, or what the kind of like the mechanisms for this innovation is in terms of. We might look at modification of components, the changing and altering of the various components to whatever it is that we're trying to put together, versus an architectural innovation where you might look at the relationship between the components, how they're put together. And all these are, they're just different ways of thinking about innovation. So you start from the innovation definition of a practical application of invention or an idea, and see that actually the idea and the innovations can actually be quite complex and quite varied and multiple layers of innovation, because you can have you could have innovation in products, but also in the way that they could be architecturally structured, those products, the way that they could be put together. And I think that one of the ways of looking at product innovations and architecture is very relevant to our digital world, in that we have seen the development of digital products, but they're all brought together in what's referred to as an ecosystem or a platform. You think about Apple's world of Macintoshes and iPhones and all its other associated products, is that they're all bundled together in its architecture within its own platform. And the various products spin out, but only if they work within that platform itself. Facebook is another example of different services and products that it's structured around a particular platform. But the architecture of the innovations, I think, is really important for our digital world. But of course, this is not the only taxonomy of innovation. You can look at them in a number of different ways. Let's have a look at some others. Henderson and Clark, the famous 2x2 academic framework of thinking about various things. Well, again, they've looked at architecture and components, which I've just drawn attention to. And you can say that you can get an incremental, architectural and modular and radical innovations, depending upon the extent to which the innovation or where the innovation comes from, whether it comes from the architecture, the way that things are built, put together, or from the knowledge. And I think that what's interesting here is the development from Schumpeter's world, where he was talking very much about the material, about the products that we could see, because he was talking about predominantly writing in a world of mass production and productive capacity. Well, I think you can argue that the world has moved on. If you go back to our curve that we introduced in the introduction, the world has moved on beyond just the product. And we've moved into a world of services, which are less materially evident, and into the cyber world, where it's difficult to see what the product might be or where the locus of value from those products might be. And particularly if you look at areas, say, which are related to finance and innovations in finance, there's whole new generations of financial tokens that kind of only exist within a ledger or within the cyber world. I'm talking about things like fungible tokens or non-fungible tokens of digital representations of art, as an example. But they're still innovations, and the products and services and other things such as derivative contracts, where you can take out derivative contracts on, say, the price of oil, or the expected shifts in the prices of oil, without the requirement to hold any oil. It's just a contract. It's effectively, it's a piece of paper, a contract between two parties. So the whole notion, therefore, of what constitutes a product or a service has been shifted by the generation of the new technologies, the digital technologies that we enjoy. And I think, you know, you could look at digital technologies and all of them could be modular, or you could see all of these different taxonomies of innovation within our world. You know? But knowledge is something that has become more integral to our current world. Is that many of you would be classed as being knowledge workers, because you're not assembling products, are you? In many respects, you might be selling promises, service guarantees. So the whole notion of the products itself and where the innovations, where the innovations sit, has become less fixed, more slippery, if you like. I think the term is liquid. After Bauman, the famous Leeds-based, or University of Leeds-based philosopher of society. And so the world has become more liquid. And liquid, of course, drips through your fingers, very hard to grasp. So the notion of where the innovation sits can also be very hard to grasp. And I think there's a danger that we might look at the innovation after the event, when something's occurred, and say, oh yes, well, that was obvious, wasn't it? And again, I don't wish to tread upon the toes of Unit 2 and Irena, because she knows much more about this than I ever will do, or want to, for that matter. But you strategic, where is where are the innovation, the strategic innovation? Where could be the locus or the focus of our innovations? The goods and services, obviously, combined in a new way, radically different, transformative experiences for customers. We can approach these things emotionally, intellectually, or spiritually engaging people. I would argue that the shift towards more ESG related products is probably more spiritual, emotional, and possibly even intellectual, but then it is tangible. Processes, which is distinct from just cost cutting or reducing the cost of something. But sure, you can have an innovation in your processes that does lead to reductions in cost, but you could also think about how you might go about recruit, how you might train, how you might allocate either capital or people to particular tasks, how you might allocate resources in a different way towards the acquisition of new customers. And value chains, innovative value chains, new market spaces, which generates additional value, both for the customer and for the company itself. One of the things I think that's very central here is the notion of the customer and understanding who that who the consumer might be, therefore, must be integral to our understanding of strategic innovation. Innovation, therefore, as we've said, leads towards the pursuit of a competitive strategy leading towards competitive advantage. And in a simple models, you get models where you differentiate the products, or you can generate through innovation in processes, cost leadership. Now, there's a challenge with this, I think, in both of these areas, because it's the first mover that benefits only. If you have a product product differentiation that's in the market that gains you competitive advantage, the rest are me too. And they might need other innovations on top of that in order to be able to supplant the initial innovation, and then they become the next first mover. But cost leadership, I think, is a more important area to talk about, in that firms, organizations, including the public sector, will look at, and I've seen this just recently with the pay increases that have been awarded to our junior doctors, saying that this needs to be delivered alongside increases in productivity. Well, how do you measure the productivity of a doctor? How do you measure the productivity of anybody that works in a service that is not determined by a financial outcome? Well, one of the ways you can do, which was innovative, I suppose, is that actually you do try and allocate a financial outcome to some of those services. So within the NHS, the innovation within the NHS was to try and turn the NHS into an internal market, so that everybody was doing things for financial numerical return. And you can argue whether or not that was successful or not. I have a view on it. The processes of reducing the levels of costs makes the firm more efficient. Well, does it? It only makes it cost efficient. It doesn't mean to say that it delivers things to its consumers more efficiently or effectively. And I'll give you an example about that, where we've used technology in order to supplant services that organizations used to do habitually, customer service. So anybody that's tried to ring a firm or tried to contact a firm about its products will have always, well, for the most part, I think, probably been frustrated by the processes of trying to do it. It's very difficult to find a contact address or a telephone number. And if you do find a telephone number, it's very difficult to actually speak to somebody through the automated systems. Similarly, it's very difficult to have you might end up having a conversation with a automated chat line, which doesn't really understand the nuance of your particular issue. But it's cost effective, but is it efficient in terms of dealing with the consumer? Bearing in mind that we said that in terms of strategic innovation, the most important element here is the consumer. So the displacement of something by, like, customer services with technology as a cost saving may not necessarily be the same as making the firm more efficient or more effective in terms of the way that it deals with its customers. And that's kind of like within all of these things, it's a challenge in terms of how you manage these opposing tensions. And the notion of an opposing tension, which we might refer to in academia as a dialectic, on the one hand, you've got a particular aspect or a point of view, and there is always an opposing point of view or dynamic, and the two opposing dynamics have a tension that exists between them, and this resolution of the tensions is a really important way of dealing with an organization and the way that we try and shift and move the organization forward. So we were talking about costs and about first mover, and the issue that I'd like you to try and get to grasp with here is, despite the fact that everybody wants to try and reduce its costs, there can only be one that's the cheapest in the market at any one particular point in time. So any one firm, and it's usually the firm that was initially the cheapest, so only one firm will be a cost leader in the market and will get competitive advantage through its costs. But that doesn't stop us from reducing our costs and looking for all kinds of innovations in processes. But maybe the consumer is not the principal beneficiary. Maybe it's the firm itself that's the beneficiary, or the shareholders of its firm, because cost cutting or cost efficiencies result in higher levels of profitability, which is a good thing. Is it? Why are high levels of profitability better than lower levels of profitability? Why do we always assume and think of firms that are worth billions, if not trillions of dollars, and have enormous turnovers and enormous profitabilities? Why are they better than something that's not set up to make a profit at all? And is our innovations therefore limited by our own way in which we perceive the world and what we're doing within it? Should we be more open? Should we be more innovative? Open towards different approaches and different ways of delivering things? And what's, of course, integral to all of this is that what is it that we're trying to deliver? Who for, how, and why? And they're the kind of like the things that really sit behind innovations. Because the innovation itself usually is a response to a problem or an issue. Decline in sales, what are we going to do about it? Too expensive, what are we going to do about it? But sitting beneath that, there's another level of questioning that says, well, why are we doing this in the first place? What are we doing? Who for? Who are the principal beneficiaries? And we'll touch upon all these questions as we go through the rest of this presentation. Another way of thinking about innovation, looking at values and value chains or value curves, really. This is innovations within a bundle of characteristics of the product. And this is IKEA. And this value curve was talked about, but really sort of nailed down, I think, in terms of a tangible sort of concept by Kim in 2015, was to look at all of the different bits and pieces of IKEA, as to say, well, can we identify within its value curve where its competitive advantage sits and where its innovations are? What's it innovative about? And the blue curve is IKEA, and the higher the mark on the higher the score is where people perceive the idea of the innovation sitting. So price is the price. I'm not sure I agree with this, actually, but the prices seem to be of a lower innovative end to other traditional furniture stores. So they're saying that IKEA don't compete on price. They don't compete on durability. Quality, design, yeah, okay. But then he goes on in terms of variety, versatility, rapidity, assortment, experience. I think is an interesting one. The experience of being at the store and buying your products, or being able to just take them home with you, is considered to be part and parcel of IKEA's value curve. I'm not sure I agree with that, as I can honestly say the last time I went to IKEA, it was a Sunday morning, and it was akin to 1,000 years of purgatory, to the extent that I said I shall never be going back to IKEA again, and as a consequence I never have. Doesn't stop my wife from buying things from IKEA, however, but thank goodness they deliver. So you can, I think, to make generalized statements about something after the fact is always challenging. And that's a concept that's known as halos. And we'll touch upon halos more specifically at in other parts of the actual course itself. But I do think that the idea of a value curve is a good intellectual exercise for you, firms, as to say that where does the value reside? How does our value reside in the innovations that we have created? Now, whichever you might, I'm sort of being a bit provocative and tongue-in-cheek, is that personally speaking, I don't like IKEA and I don't like going to their stores, but I can see that it's different, and I can genuinely appreciate the fact that there is an innovation in terms of the way that the store has been structured and its products are delivered to market, etc., etc. I get that. There's no such thing as a universal innovation, is there? Or one that's been universal. Well, that's not correct. It's not universally accepted in the same way. People perceive things in different ways. One innovation to somebody else, which is positive, might be another innovation to somebody else that's less positive. And so you're looking at the critical success factors of the organization, the business, and the products and its innovations. Increasing above industry standards for the purpose of increasing product value. Customers consider them to be key value attributes. Not required according to industry standards, but could be created for the purposes. So you might want to go above industry standards, but it's not actually that movement above the industry standard might not be required. Yeah, so there's a difference between a necessity and a desire to move above them. And you can apply these questions back to the value curve to say that what's going on here. But it's just, I think it's a useful way of exploring how we may innovate in order to be able to produce critical success values within a whole different raft and range of product attributes, and the reasoning and the rationale behind it. In other words, the rationale and the reasoning behind it can be varied, but the important thing from my perspective that I take from all of this is again coming back to this question about what is it that we're trying to do. Do we understand what it is that we're trying to do, what we're trying to achieve, and why? And then we can think about how. And Schumpeter is very famous for this expression of creative destruction. Now, I wouldn't necessarily advocate looking at Wikipedia to try and find out anything, because most of it's challengeable at best. But actually, there's quite a good page on creative destruction on Wikipedia. So if you wanted something quick and easy to try and get your head around what it's talking about, then go for it. But you didn't hear it from me. So creative destruction is this process, which is Schumpeter argues is integral to capitalism, to business. We're living in a capitalist world, liberal market society is capitalist. It's essential, it's integral to it. And competitive advantage comes out because of the competitive pressures, which forces change within the organization, or may force change within the market itself, which leads to innovation, which will therefore create more competitive advantage. So there's this ongoing cycle. But the creative destruction element of this is that we might have to break down things that we've done in the past. And what Schumpeter argues is that at times you can get social, political, economic upheaval, which creates the environment, technological, creates the environment from which the innovations are both, or the technology is both causal and also contributes towards this process of flux, this highly changeable environment. So as an example, you might look at the creation of the MP3 player, which wasn't from Sony or from Apple. I think it was a company called Seihan out of Korea, which had a very rudimentary MP3 player. But from that creation, that innovation, that technical innovation, we got the iPod. And then from the iPod, you get that bundled into a phone, which then means that you get everybody's smartphone becomes your music player, which then means that the music that you're consuming is consumed by a stream of data rather than you holding an MP3 or a CD or a piece of plastic. So within the technology there, it's led to a series of innovations through which people try and attain levels of competition. But bearing in mind, of course, is that the product enhancement itself is temporary, as people will copy it. And as a consequence of that, we need to build in bundles of characteristics like the value curve, IKEA's value curve, which says that this is the thing that makes it more, gives it more longevity within the market. So in terms of Apple and its creation of its products, is that you can't deny that they look kind of groovy. And so Apple's innovation is probably less in the technology and more to do with its style, and more to do with the way that it, in the architecture of its products and the way that it all reacts together and works together. Which, as somebody who is a bit of an Apple fan, and I have been for a number of years, I don't think that Apple's products work as seamlessly well as they used to do. Now, maybe that's because of the complexity of its own architecture, I don't know. But trying to upgrade from one thing to another, phones work well, but computers, iMacs and that sort of thing don't work as well as perhaps they once did. Maybe that's my problem because of the fact that I don't understand the technology as quite as much as I used to do. But the technology used to be quite intuitive and quite seamless, and it strikes me as being less so now. But that's not the most important thing, perhaps, in terms of the product characteristics of Apple's products. The fact that they work together. They do work together, but maybe they just don't work as seamlessly as they used to do. People are buying them predominantly because of the fact that they're cool and groovy. But nevertheless, you get this cycle of creative destruction. And what's the most important part of this is that Schumpeter says that markets, businesses, society are not stable. They are subject to levels of change, which can come from lots of different factors. And then it's the relationship between change, innovation, competitive advantage, and competition itself that generates these cycles of business growth moving into the future. Process of creative destruction. So technologically driven business environment requires firms to embrace the change and therefore to innovate. And there are tensions that exist here, aren't they? Is that we adopt and we implement the technology, the digital infrastructures that we all use, but there are challenges with it, usually about cost and implementation and so on and so forth. But there is an overwhelming imperative to embrace the change and to innovate in a digital world. To an extent, we've created our own momentum. We need to adopt this technology. We need to adopt that technology. And you can see that within the adoption of AI and large language models and generative AI within firms. Because that's where it's perceived to be the source of competitive advantage. It's unlikely that actually just the adoption of AI will give anybody competitive advantage unless you are the firm that's supplying the AI in the first instance. But that doesn't stop us. And it's typified by this expression, which I think comes from Mark Zuckerberg. And Facebook, which is to move fast and break things. Disruptive in the market through technologies. Do you remember the narratives around Uber, that Uber was just disrupting the taxi market? There's an example that's given in a book called Unscaled by Taneja, and he talks about Livongo, whereas Livongo is this health app, basically, and it's a highly innovative piece of technology. But really, Livongo became successful when it was acquired by a bigger corporation that bought it. And that's how a lot of firms deal with the disruption. They buy in the technologies. And Google, as an example, is a voracious consumer of other firms' technologies, much of which is unlikely to ever see the light of day. But it necessitates that we should let go and we should reformulate our current business models and create new business models. But before we go on and talk about business models, which I think is a really interesting concept because of the way that it attempts to define the source of value, our competitive advantage, and how the business operates, or how the business should operate. I just want to touch upon other forms or other sources or ways of thinking about innovation within our environments. And one of the most simplistic sort of ways, leaving Schumpeter behind a little bit, is the source of innovation can be seen as being exogenous or endogenous, i.e. exogenous in terms of it exists outside of us. And when we talked about technology in the previous tutorial, there are these different framings of technology, this deterministic aspect which sits outside of us, and then there is the endogenous framing of technology, which says that technology and innovation comes from within us. It doesn't sit outside of us. And the deterministic aspect of it tends to be one that's supported by economics, in that economics and economics models sit outside of us. There's a market that sits outside of us. And if you look at the representations of the market, which is a sort of a graph with a cross on it, which is demand and supply curves, and price and quantities, to say that that's what constitutes the market, the pricing, the quantities that's produced, and so on and so on and so forth. But the market and the interactions of the market sits outside of the people, which strikes me as being, but it's classified, isn't it, or it's defined in terms of Adam Smith's guiding hand of the market. But importantly, the market is outside of us, and therefore it results in quite a, I would argue, a perverse form of thinking about innovation and investment in the firm, the organization, because it starts from an odd perspective that assumes that the agents of innovation, people, are not really involved in it. Returns on investment, the firm itself is treated therefore as being a black box. In other words, the actual mechanisms of the innovation itself are a given and don't need to be explored. The driving force of innovation is the act of investment itself and the investment decision. The act of investment delivers a return. The process through which that it happens is not really materially important. The firm itself is a black box. And yet, you must know from your own experiences that just because somebody issues an investment decision with a associated level of return, whether it be as an internal rate of return or a net present value or whatever it might well be, doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's going to happen. And yet economics assumes that it does. Returns that are made by the firm need to be considered in light of also the socially derived returns through the investment in the technological advance or the innovation. And the argument is that society derives far more than just the firm does. Society will derive more than the initial costs of the investment. This is indicating that investment should be done by profit-making firms, and investments and decisions or research into technologies and everything that occurs outside of that, not done by the firm, is regarded as being a market failure, which sort of like is a very limited way of thinking about innovations. A supply of socially beneficial research or innovation is regarded as being suboptimal. Optimal research, optimal innovation is done within a profit-making firm because the investment decision triggers the returns. And that's the most important aspect. And it can only be commercially valuable if it can be protected from others using it. So there's a whole raft of legalese designed to protect innovations. And in fact, one of the ways in which firms measure its own innovative status is to account for the amount of patents that it has on its intellectual property. Bearing in mind, of course, is that you don't need to own the intellectual property to be able to protect it. But the argument here is that innovation belongs within the firm itself, triggered by an investment decision, justified by its returns socially and financially, and that it can be protected, and it ought to be protected. However, I did a piece of research with a colleague of mine. He's a mate, he's a friend of mine, Neil Simpson. Neil's a big head honcho of an R&D department within a petrochemical company. And we were talking about innovation within the firm, and he was saying that we were questioning where are the big innovations, because in my view, any firm that uses petrol oil as its foundation for the majority of its products, innovations in the utilization of that, radical innovations in that. So if you could displace oil with something else, some kind of synthetic polymer, to be able to produce the same sorts of products, is that you would have a dramatic impact upon global warming, and that would be classed as a huge radical innovation. So I was talking about where's the work in this, and he said, well, there really isn't much. And so we did some research into the chemical industry to look at barriers to innovation. What we wanted to do is we wanted to try and explore the black box. And we found that there are issues that are challenging for the exogenous view of innovation as a consequence of technology. And the issues were threefold. They were cultural, structural, and then the latter one, which is about narrative devices of conviction, which I'll come on to in a minute. But there are lots of cultural issues. People, we found within the chemical industry, whether this resonates with you, didn't want to be associated with large innovations and large projects because the risk to them personally was quite high. So we don't want to look at research into dealing with the polymers, radical innovations, because there was a chance it might not work. And if it didn't work, then that would impact me. And that was a risk. And as a consequence of that is that people wanted to have a portfolio of successful innovations that sat behind them, which meant that they were small incremental processes. Now, that's a legitimate part of the innovative process, and I get that. Science itself tends to be very innovative. It tends to be rather incremental. But when you've culturally started to think about innovations or certain things as being innovative that are justified only by its own internal narratives, these narrative devices of conviction, it becomes somewhat more problematic. And I'll give you an example of how this works. One firm had created a different paint, but it wasn't different, but it was marketed as being an innovation, but it was just a different shade of blue. And actually the shade of blue was not discernibly different to my eye than other shades of blue that were already available on the market. And yet the firm itself said that this was an innovation. And as a consequence, the firms can say that we are innovative. They claim that they are innovative, but actually the innovations from the outside, when you look at them through different lenses, maybe nothing of the sort, but that doesn't stop the firm from actually claiming, or the industry claiming, that it's innovative. We talked about Apple earlier on, is that how innovative is Apple really, when broadly speaking it uses the same tech repackaged in different boxes? And the new iPhone, whatever we're at now, the 15 or something, might generate more pixels and have more colors that you can't really pick up, or have a different clarity of camera, but it's not discernible to the human eye. How innovative are these things really? And sometimes we need to look at these claims as to say, well, are they legitimate claims of innovation, or are they just narrative devices that convince us that we're being innovative? And similarly, we can use the structural issues, such as measures of innovation like patents, in order to justify the fact that we are innovative. We are an innovative firm, a firm that might claim that we've got hundreds and hundreds of patents, and use that as a measure of proving its own innovation. But in reality, what we've done is we've produced a new blue. So it's this interaction of narrative convictions and structural issues and cultural issues that really, to our mind at the time anyway, pose significant barriers to the whole process of innovation within the firm. Because what it does in the initial outset, it says, what are the acceptable levels of innovation that we can, what is acceptable to the firm in terms of an innovation, and where is the risk, and what's the risk to the individual as well as the firm. And it was a very interesting dynamic. And if I was to draw a more generalized conclusion, I would actually run contrary to those perspectives that come out of economics, is to actually say that radical innovation doesn't come out of firms at all, profit-making firms. So as a consequence of that, we might need to seek different areas for those innovations, which is why firms will try and associate themselves with smaller, lighter SMEs and so on and so forth, where the innovations are coming from. But there's huge risks to all of that. And the processes itself are also culturally, structurally, narratively challenging. So in the process of doing this work, I was mindful of something that I'd read about. And so I did a little bit of work and tried to pick this out. And I found this, which is called the Lucas Plan. And I present it here as being another potential source of innovation, but also to show you how those barriers to innovation can be closed down because they're not culturally acceptable. January 1976, a long time ago, workers at Lucas Aerospace, it's worth pointing out is that Lucas Aerospace was under serious risk of closing down because of lack of profitability, orders, so on and so on and so forth. And it came to the attention of the government is that we're going to close this huge production plant down, which I think was in the West Midlands in Birmingham somewhere. And there was no alternative to this. Well, the workforce, the trade union, led by the trade union movement, the workforce, the trade union movement, its suppliers, and so on and so on and so forth, got together and crafted what has become known as the Lucas Plan. They democratized the innovation process. And the plan itself produced a list of potential innovations in product innovations and moving the firm into a particular area. And it suggested that the firm should move away from the manufacture and construction of aeroplane parts. And actually, they made a lot of parts for cars as well. But what they should do is they should focus their energies on turning their innovative and engineering practices, which they were good at, into socially useful innovations. The whole process was about democratizing technology, and it was extraordinarily radical at the time. You can't imagine anybody doing this now, can you? So imagine how radical it was in 1976. So it is worth pointing out that in the late 1970s, is that probably union power was at its highest. But it was extraordinarily radical at the time. I mean, I was around at the time, but I don't particularly remember it. It's only through my own research and reading back at the sort of the accounts of the day about how radical it was. But they were looking to design socially useful production. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Now, when you start to think about how firms are adopting ESG measures to look at socially useful firms. The idea of ESG is not new by any stretch of the imagination. Anyway, they put the plan together, and it was, very well received by government, etc., etc. Apart from the fact that the senior managers of Lucas Aerospace said, "No, we're not doing any of that. We're going to close it down," and that's what they did. So the point of me drawing attention to this is that where does the innovation come from? What's the locus? What's the focus? The locus of the innovations. By and large, the idea that innovation comes from an investment decision made by the financiers actually doesn't bear out much in practice. And innovation can come from lots of different areas and different places. And we have to be quite careful about how we close a lot of these things down, or how we may not seek to even close them down, but they get closed down because people will say, "Well, that's not going to work around here. That's not acceptable." So the Lucas Plan. There's an interesting piece of work by Maria Mazzucato, which I've called The Innovative State. I think the book itself is called The Entrepreneurial State. But what Mazzucato details is case studies of significant innovations. Space travel, the internet, Concorde, all of which were financed predominantly by the state itself. And state employees created these amazing technological innovations. Mission-driven finance, mission-driven government. And the one in the top right-hand corner there is the polio virus. That when I was a kid, there was quite an incidence of polio, people suffering from polio. But I've forgotten his name now. I'll put his name on screen. Found a vaccine for the polio virus. But rather than commercializing it, he gave it away. Which is kind of staggering, isn't it? But they're all examples of mission-driven innovation, financed predominantly by money from the state. And I'm not quite, some of you might know this better, more than me, but I'm not quite sure to what extent was government money used to finance the first viral or cure to a virus, and how much was that used and how much was public money, government money. used in creating the COVID, or as a response to the COVID virus? I don't know. You can tell me. My guess is it's probably higher than we know. But sources of innovation. So that brings me back to this notion of business model. What is it, and is it still relevant in a stakeholder-driven business world? So what is a business model? These are just some suggestions. In other words, and you'd not be surprised about this in terms of social science, would you? If there's a term, there's a construct out there, there'll be 1,000,001 definitions of what they all are. But they can't all be wrong. So there's lots of different ways of thinking about business models. But I think what's most important about this is not the notion of what is a business model, is that your firms or your organizations will probably have business models. And actually, you don't need to be in the private sector to have a business model. You can be in the public sector as well and have a business model. It just depends on how you determine what your business is. Business connotes with making a profit. It doesn't need to. The organization, so maybe it should be an organizational model. Maybe some of you might be happier with that, but it's a business model. What are they? If you've got one, if you have one, is that, do you understand what it's supposed to do? Why do you have it? What does it say? And how does it work? How does it determine? And that's the important thing, less than what is it by definition, because it could be all of those things. It could be none of it. It's something completely different. But if you've got one, how do you use it? Could you explain it to somebody else that's not in your industry, that's outside your sector? And the challenge, of course, from the idea and the concept of business model is that it's incorporated a whole raft of basic theories taken from all over the place. What is without doubt is that there is an independent concept called a business model, and it's different from the mainstream. So it's very difficult to deny that one exists, or the fact that it's significant. So on the basis that they exist and they're probably significant, we really ought to understand more about what they actually are and how we use them and how we might construct them. Increasingly, they're becoming more and more abstract to fit a company's structure and architecture, broken into a series of components. As a consequence, the strategic components of the business model have taken an increased level of significance. Allied to this, with the boom in the tech economy, has led to the increased prevalence of the utilization of the term business model. So the business model has become synonymous with the strategic elements of the tech industry or the tech business. And as firms move more and more and more towards digital transformation, so we increase the use of the business model. And you think about narratives of conviction. In order to convince others of our technological prowess, perhaps the adoption of a business model is an essential part of that conviction. The business model is murky at best, or the definition of the business model is murky at best. It seems to refer to a loose conception of how a company does business and generates revenue, yet simply having a business is an exceedingly low bar set for building a company. The business model approach to management becomes an invitation for faulty thinking and self-delusion. In other words, you can hide behind the notion of a business model and convince yourself that everything's right with the world. Generally, business models comprise of 5 elements. I'm not sure I particularly agree with this, to be honest, but whatever the business model does comprise of, the essence of the business model really ought to be about creation and capture of value. But does the value therefore need to be expressed as being just economic or monetary value? And what we mean by value is actually one of the great unsolved conundrums of business and economics. But by and large, value is expressed as being financial. It doesn't need to be. As an example, a colleague of mine, a guy by the name of Adam Lever, wrote a paper on the BBC and its business models, which was not expressed in terms of financial value. So a hospital, as an example, could have a business value, a business model where it expressed value in terms of patient care and steers away from the dominance of its financing. It just demands a shift in our emphasis and innovation in thought. Let's consider the influence of technology on a business model. Reasonable to suggest that innovation in technology requires an equal innovation in the business model, which might well require and necessitate that the end user is at the core of the model rather than our own internal stakeholders. In some cases, the value that's driven for the firm and the value to the consumer can be conflated together. Customers benefit. We're doing this because it will benefit our customers. But I just wonder whether or not that's a narrative of a justificatory narrative of conviction rather than something that's real and material. And the predominant beneficiaries are our internal stakeholders, namely management, senior management, and shareholders. Where I refer to justificating or narrative devices of conviction, I think is the accurate terminology that I used in the paper. I'll give you an example here. We talk about Wirecard. Wirecard was the new kid on the block. It was the star. It promised that its technology was going to innovate payment processes. But actually, whilst it became a significant force because of its presentation of its technological prowess and its business models, it all fell apart when it was realized that the technology was not significant, and that even though this business was a fintech, it was more financial than technology, and it was the finance that brought it down. If you don't know the story, is that basically it was a fraudulent business that was operating, but continued to operate whilst insolvent and generate capital through the presentation of its business models. You can't hide behind a business model. It needs to be real and tangible. And I think that whilst the business model might be something that's defined in terms of like capturing, what did we say it was? In essence, the business model is about the creation and capture of value. I think there's an element missing to the business model definition. I'd like to introduce that here. And actually, the business model is about achieving financial viability. All organizations need to be financially viable. Financial viability is about how you create and you capture value, however you determine what value is. But there is a requirement that the money is dealt with. And the business model needs to satisfy chief stakeholder concerns. Because if it doesn't, and things go wrong, the chief stakeholders have got the authority and the power to withdraw their support, which will bring the rapid end to that particular enterprise. And this is okay to an extent. Some stakeholders are more significant than others. The chief stakeholder are more significant than others. The firm's stakeholders, the various stakeholders, are not of equal status in either promise or practice. So a business model can be skewed towards meeting the needs of its primary stakeholder rather than the shareholders, other stakeholders, which might be at the core or should be at the core of the digital transformation. Let me give you an example. At the risk of upsetting those of you that work within the NHS, it's not intended, by the way, it's just how I've interpreted it after working with the alongside people from the NHS for a long time, is that the chief stakeholder of the NHS is usually classed as being the patient, and that our chief concern, the chief concern of the NHS, is one of patient care. I dispute that, because I think that the chief stakeholder of the NHS is government, because the patients themselves are assets. They arrive with the price tag. And so you end up with a very complicated structure. Not surprisingly, you end up with a very complicated business. It should be about patient care, but I don't think it is. And in the private sector, particularly for listed firms, the chief stakeholder is the shareholder. And the shareholder's concerns outweigh considerably other stakeholders, particularly the consumer and the environment, as an example. Certainly outweigh the concerns of the employee, because the organisation is structured in order to make and to maximise the returns back to the shareholder, who holds the rights to the free cash flow. Well, without the free cash flow, you can't really do much else. So which is why I add in the notion of about in promise and in practice, is that we might promise, we might say that we are a customer-focused firm or a employee, people-focused firm, but as soon as we see a downturn in share price, we might be laying off hundreds of members of staff in order to be able to reclaim the share price again. So you need to look at these things, not just in terms of the narrative devices and conviction, but the realities. What can you empirically see and what can you empirically observe? And draw your conclusions from that. So I want to leave you with these series of questions, which are also on the Blackboard site. And I'd like you to have a go at answering them and posting your views on the discussion forum. And I encourage you to do this. And I encourage you to comment upon other people's posts as well. So the questions that I'm asking are these. At the point of our technological zenith, at the high point of our technological development, why does work still take up so much of our time and energy? Why are organisations becoming more rational and more bureaucratic, or rationally bureaucratic? Who do organisations innovate for? And are the spoils of work distributed equitably? You could reframe that. Why do organisations innovate? And should the spoils of work be distributed equitably? And if not, why not? Who are the winners and the losers of technological driven work and organisation? I said on the Blackboard site, have a go at 2, but I'd like you to have a go at the third, this last one, as one of your 2. Are the questions that I've just posed, are they business related questions or are they ethical questions? Is there a difference? See you soon.